Yeah, I thought what I would do today is kind of walk through a little bit of my journey at UCSD, how I got here, and um, this program, which started as a research project, and how it really has grown in a way that was much beyond just the researcher involvement here, and um, kind of a unique program in terms of how we've been able to take our research and really extend it out on a much more personal level than I ever thought possible with the work that we do here in the field of ocean sciences. So a little bit about myself, kind of as Nancy could probably attest to with the varied proposals that would go in. Really, my background's in engineering. I do work with hydrodynamics and engineering fluids. I study the ocean, and we develop various robotic systems now more and more, using different sensors to understand how the ocean works. Kind of my background, I actually spent some time in Australia. I had a undergraduate degree from UCSD, and then subsequently got my PhD at Scripps, and here I am now. Kind of the history there was funded by and large through the Navy, with my graduate school paid by the Office of Naval Research. In 1999, I received an award, which was really just an endorsement from the Office of Naval Research saying, try to stay in the field, Eric. So here 20 years later or more, I have done that. And now I'm presently the director of the Marine Physical Laboratory, which has a rich history that dates to actually World War II, and the university's involvement of really rallying to kind of contribute its scientific insight and personnel to help the U.S. in a kind of a dark set of years for the country. So Project Recover, we are where we are now is a collaborative effort between three organizations, and it really came about through some historical work we were doing in applying robots to study coral reefs and do surveys in lagoons and the Pacific, and in fact in the island nation of Palau, and met a few passionate individuals who are very interested in finding and returning MIA from American losses overseas. And one thing led to another, and we found that robotic technologies we had were very good at finding aviation debris on the seafloor. And since that has kind of spiraled into a pretty significant effort that has involved many people, we've now done searches in over 20 countries, have found over many aviation losses associated with a few hundred missing in action now that we're working towards the recoveries and bringing closure to families. And so this program is called Project Recover. It was initially actually funded as a STEM outreach program by the Office of Naval Research, and that was what funded Scripps involvement. And we in fact had a very generous donation from a private individual that led us to help get a 501c3 formed around that. This gives you an idea of the countries that we've done field expeditions. Both the Pacific theater and the European theater had a rich number of losses, but we've also done work in Alaska and Central America. In fact, there's some losses associated with World War II. So that for kind of keep it fun, take you on a little bit of a tour of some of the areas that we've worked in and the technologies we've worked with that have come about from our research. The kind of interplay between the work we do and some interest from the Navy have allowed us to kind of develop and mature these technologies. And part of our program is really kind of looking at thinking, you can think about it as like, which golf club do you use for which hole? In this case, we're choosing which technologies do we use for which operating environment, whether it's a coral reef environment or if it's a deep water environment. There's different robots and different tools that we might use. And ultimately, what we try to do is we find and document these sites and the science behind that documentation has allowed us to really develop a coherent picture of a crash site. Think of it as like NCIS meets FAA. If there's an airplane crash in real life, they have a very, the Transportation Safety Board will do a very heavily forensic study. We are doing these forensic studies on 70-year-old aviation losses and setting up the archaeological site for eventual recovery of remains. So introduce you to one of the tools that we use. This is a Remus 100 underwater robot. It can stay underwater for approximately 8 hours. It's rated to 100 meters or 300 feet. And we use this tool routinely for oceanographic studies. And one of the systems that we use on board here is a type of sonar that allows us to image the seabed, very much like how you might use medical ultrasound to do medical imaging. And this gives you an idea of what objects look like on the seabed. And I think that the right-hand image is probably the easiest one to, you don't need to be a sonar analyst to say that there's an airplane there sitting on the seabed. And that in fact was a aircraft that we found off of Papua New Guinea. The upper left is a wing of an aircraft, and the lower left is parts of a B-24 debris field, which you can see is a little harder to detect against some of the other background coral heads and rocks that are on the seabed. So a number of interesting sort of data analysis challenges go into doing detection of some of these crash sites in the sonar imagery. Ultimately, what's driven the 501c3 is really connecting that science to finding the aircraft and the aviation losses to families that have lost loved ones in wars. And it's been really, I would say, one of the high points of my career is to quietly be able to go to some of these funerals and seeing the turnouts, not only the family, but the entire community rallying behind the final closure there of some of these MIA losses. And that's been a real special time. This is a Bud Roberzak. He was lost. This was a plane site that we found in Palau. The Defense POW MIA accounting agency did a remain recovery and successfully identified remains. Little did I know that there's viable DNA within bones that have been in the ocean over 70 years, a little morbid to think about, but really a special time for the families, and seeing the turnout has just been real fulfilling to see how these losses and being able to provide the closure to these families and how impactful it's been. And to give you an idea of kind of what a day at sea looks like in the Pacific, this is warmer waters. This is the Remus vehicle getting ready to be deployed. You can see two people can lift it, and once it's deployed, it then has a programmed mission that can search the seabed. This gives you this video, if this is playing for you, shows the robot now underway, coming up to get a GPS and now diving. And that robot then can stay underwater for hours on end, using its sonar to search the seafloor. In terms of losses within sort of past conflicts, one of the interests that we've received from the US government is that there's still over 80,000 US soldiers remaining unaccounted for as a result of past conflicts. And over half of these are thought to be associated with underwater sites. And at the close of World War II, and then after the Vietnam War, there is a merger of a few different agencies within the US, but the US carries a responsibility for finding and returning home lost soldiers. And this agency is now the Defense POW MIA County Agency. Many of you might see the black MIA flag that was often associated with this agency. Previously, it was known as JPAC, or the Joint POW Accounting Command. This map here shows you the staggering number of losses in the different theaters. And as you can see, the Pacific has some of the greatest number of losses. So thinking about underwater losses, the kinds of work we do at Scripps really seemed like a good fit for us being able to contribute in some small way, introductions of new technologies to the government. One thing we found through this effort is that these underwater sites actually have a greater degree of preservation and greater probability of recovery in comparison to terrestrial losses. The underwater archaeological community is much smaller than the land-based archaeological community. And so it's been a bit of an educational process with the US government, making them aware of the real opportunity they have here with regards to finding sites that are underwater. So one thing we've done as a group is developed a case file management system. These numbers are a little bit outdated, but we actually have now thousands of cases that are around the country. This gives you a map of Papua New Guinea, where there was a number of campaigns in the US as we pushed towards Japan in the 40s. And within this case file management system, we have over 50,000 historical files. So Project Recover now has some full-time historians. We have an underwater archaeologist that's actually a Scripps employee that we hired away from the US government. And so there's full-time staff that actually comb the National Archives to collect information that can be used to piece together some of the information that help lead to some of our campaigns that we undertake. Give you an idea what Life at Sea is. This is a research vessel that we operated off called the research vessel Petrel. This was off of a case with the Philippines, and in Mindoro, there was identified losses with a particular crash site that we had found. We often try to choose sites that have maybe there's several losses in the area, so that as we mount campaigns that we can, if we don't find a particular target we're after, there might be others that we might be successful with. This gives you an example of something that we didn't anticipate finding. This, in fact, was a U.S. Liberty ship that was lost in December 28, 1944. It's 422 feet long, and you can see the seabed image here. And then we just overlaid here kind of a line drawing of that Liberty ship here, showing you that scale of it. And, really quite exciting being able to dive on these sites and find these are sites that really are hallowed ground that haven't been quietly resting for over 75 years without the general public knowing about their location. And being able to use these tools to find sites like this has always been pretty exciting. This is a campaign we did in Hansa Bay. Hansa Bay is in Papua New Guinea, a very remote area. There's a volcano offshore. It's like straight out of a movie, if you could imagine, with smoke coming out of the volcano while you're doing research. And we, in fact, Papua New Guinea has, I would just say it's a very austere area to operate in. Even though the chartering of a dive boat looks pretty comfortable, I'll have to assure you it wasn't the most comfortable area to do operations. But I wanted to walk you through a little bit of some of the historical data that we use to put together our cases. In this case, this was a eyewitness account from the 40s. Somebody explaining how they were flying in number 2 position. The lost aircraft Tennyson was in the number 3. This paragraph here on the last sentence in the paragraph shows how in 2 or 3 seconds, flames enveloped the plane from the first bomb bay to the tail. The plane rose nose first and banked slightly to the left. And then he recalls seeing 3 men jumped or fell out of the rear of the plane. And then a 4th object also fell out, but appeared to be the camera. Tragically, the first man wore no chute and spread eagle straight down to the water. The 3rd man was wearing a parachute and he didn't see where it opened. And then he later recounts how the tail assembly broke off and fell into the ocean. And then the plane banked left and dove into a slip into the water a quarter of a mile off the point. All 4 engines were running until the plane hit the water. So that's some of the historical information we had for this particular site. This lower right-hand image actually is an image taken during a bombing run. You can see, it's clearly black and white. This was scanned from the National Archives. Here's that volcano I was referring to. And this is that point that they were referring to. So this is some of the intelligence that we have. The facts are that they said it was off the point with a particular heading. They said it was a quarter mile. And we're able to then deploy the robots and start doing scans off of the point here based on some of that information. And you can imagine a long journey just to get to, taking an 8-person team from UCSD all the way to the other side of the world. And before you know it, you're working off of a volcano looking for an airplane that was lost 70 years ago. So sometimes you have to pinch yourself and say, am I really doing this? And we were in fact doing this. This particular case had a real kind of personal impact to us, because it turns out that at the loss of the aircraft, many of the mothers associated with the crash site actually were corresponding with each other, and really built a bond between these families that existed through today. And we weren't aware of this, that they actually had like a reunion meetings every so often of the various families associated with the lost individuals to this aircraft. And there was 9 individuals inside the airplane. We've heard about 3 that had left before it finally crashed. And just hearing how some of the families, still were seeking answers to this loss kind of really fueled us to be able to go after search for this aircraft. This gives you an example. This is in 2017. And the scanning that we did, what looks like farm rows here actually was a result of the robots day after day swimming and doing surveys, driving back and forth in what we call a mow the lawn pattern. And you could think of this as like a tractor taking care of the fields. And as the surveys kind of sped up, you could see just in time here kind of the amount of real estate that we began to cover with the robots in this embayment here called Hansa Bay. And so the final coverage maps look like this. We in fact found several aircraft. We had a 7-person team with a number of different robots. And this in fact was the B-24 aircraft that I kind of read through some of the after action report with the first person recounts of seeing the loss. We were in fact able to find that broken tail assembly that's referred to in that 70-year-old document, and the various parts of the airplane were identified in the sonar imagery. And we were in fact able to put a camera down and on a different type of robot and take pictures of it. Here you see the landing gear in the lower right. And this was at close to 300 feet. And the Navy is actually planning to visit this site. In fact, they had visited it just before COVID, and the volcano started to erupt, and they actually had to leave earlier just due to safety reasons. But I was pleased to hear just recently that the Navy's going back with an experimental dive group in early next year to do the final recovery of the remains from the site based on this information that we've collected here. Kind of another campaign that I thought I would talk about to assure you that I just don't travel to warm water areas. This is actually the island on the Aleutian Island chain called Kiska, Alaska, and it's actually it was quite intriguing. The archaeologist that I work with, Drew Pietruska, brought this campaign to my attention. So there's a little known battle that happened in Alaska that after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had mounted a strategy to take Midway Island, and in a ruse to draw U.S. forces out of Midway, planned to attack Alaska, and indeed did that. We had some outposts up in the Aleutian Islands, and the U.S. had turned out had intercepted encrypted radio communications amongst the Japanese that their intelligence was able to, the U.S. was able to piece together that in fact Kiska, Alaska was really just kind of a ruse to draw the U.S. away from Midway. So it turns out Kiska, Alaska is the only time, it was the only time the U.S. has had foreign occupation of U.S. territory. and in fact was sort of held from the public. The public was not made aware of the large battle that took place here and the Japanese occupation of the land, because they didn't want to put the U.S. general public in panic. And I don't think our social media was as strong in the 40s as it is now. So I think the U.S. was able to keep this under wraps a little bit. So a little bit of a kind of a unknown war or unknown battle that took place there, and there was a number of losses. So we are in fact funded by NOAA to develop a survey plan here to characterize the underwater archaeological resources. This gives you just some of the photographs of the U.S. Aviation. In fact, there was also a battleship was lost. It ran into a mine and sank, the Uss Abner Reed. And so there's a number of significant losses that occurred up there, and nobody has ever done the mapping and surveying for any of those losses and until Scripps. So we chartered a vessel. Again, shout out to our folks like Nancy, who had to do kind of some creative paperwork to get boats that are chartered and safe enough for us to operate on. And this was one of such vessels that became our research vessel. It was a converted fishing boat. And just give you some ideas of what it's like working at sea here, and get an idea of the cloud cover. And this is a sunny day in the Aleutian Islands. So I'll give you an example of some of the tools we use. This is a multi-beam sonar. We found a float plane that had been lost up there, and this is the underside of a ship hull, and that hole here actually is where a ammunition had been dropped from an airplane and fell and went all the way through the ship hull and sunk it. And that sonar, even through the murkiness of the seawater, sound penetrates really well, and we're able to do a very detailed mapping of that ship hull. So here's a typical day at sea, deploying the robots, tending them, and the survey area that we covered. So there's a few hundred square kilometers were surveyed here as part of that survey. And just to give you some examples of the tools we used. In this case, this is a 78-foot long Japanese mini submarine that was found. Turns out up in this island base, the Japanese had established a number of Japanese mini submarines, and they were lost during some of the battles, and we were able to find and document those quite well. In August 18th, 1943, USS Abner Reed actually ran into a mine and lost 70 foot of its stern. And it turns out this is quite tragic, because that's with the kind of steerage quarters. There was 71 sailors on board in their bunks in the stern section. And when the mine, it actually broke the ship in half, or broke off this tail section, but the ship managed to actually limp back to, was secured and was towed subsequently back to another island. And so they didn't lose the entire ship. It was actually sunk off the Philippines many years later, or a few years later. But this was lost in 300-foot water depth, and nobody had ever found this stern section of the USS Abner Reed. So on the lower left upper left gives you an example of what the sonar targets look like when we eventually found that stern section. And on the right-hand section, those bright little dots around it are actually fish aggregating. So it's actually become quite a wonderful reef full of sea life in this stern section. And on the left-hand side, on the bottom, you see actually line drawings from the naval architects that designed the boat, overlaid with the sonar imagery, and you get an idea how we were able to piece this together and do the documentation of that site. This is a little robot that we deployed, and we were able to go down there, and here's some pictures of those fish. You can just see it's teeming with fish right now. So that was a wonderful, wonderful find. And in fact, now at the Navy Memorial at Washington, D.C., there's a plaque now acknowledging the losses of those 71 sailors that were found through this effort. So talking a little more about the technology that we use here, this is that Remus, what we call a Remus. It's a robot that can go to 300 feet. Um, one thing we do when we are doing these projects are we try to piece together the forensic information as much as we can. And this is a sequence of images of, you can see a boat here. There's a supply boat, and the Japanese had camouflaged it with palm branches. And we see an airplane actually crash landing in the water. And so trying to use these historical photographs to identify exactly where the losses happened takes a bit of sleuthing. But we ended up flying our own drone, and on the lower right is an actual image of that same scene on the left-hand side. And from that, we were able to position where we think some of these splash locations are on modern era coastlines. So, as an educational institution, you might be wondering, how do we draw graduate students in to participate on projects like this? And so this gives you an example of a graduate student who worked in our group, kind of just to walk you through a vignette here of where he developed a new type of magnetometer. So think of this as a metal detector for a robot. And the principles of it's a very small type of metal detector that we could deploy on the robot. This is your physics 101 lesson for the day. In a magnetic field created by iron, if you were to drive a robot through it, it actually creates a signal. And that signal is very small, but if you have a very sensitive detector, you can detect this magnetic signal. And so that's in fact what we did here, deployed and built that sensor. And then we're able to drive that robot in the area and identified hotspots that eventually we found were aviation debris associated with those historic black and white photos that I showed you earlier. So PhD student, Scripps UCSD, doing some very basic technology development for robots. And then we were able to extend that into a search here on the other side of the planet to actually find aviation losses. So kind of fun to be able to take graduate students and put them in the environment here in kind of a non-scripted way. So I've kind of walked through kind of different robotic technologies. The last tool that we often use are imaging techniques. In the upper left is a photograph of, this is actually me taking pictures of a crash site at about 100-foot water depth. And we've developed techniques now where we can take many, many pictures and stitch them together to create a 3D model. So this particular crash site, now shown on the lower bottom figure, is a 3D representation of this crash site on the seabed, put together with imaging that we were able to use thousands of these pictures and bring them together full circle into one great big 3D model, which has been really helpful for planning the dive teams for subsequent dives. This is kind of the last image. I just want to wrap up. This was quite an interesting loss that was found off of the coast of Papua New Guinea, and it turned out it was George Herbert Walker Bush's wingman, and he had always recounted how he was on the same bombing run when he lost his dear friend, and has written about it several times in biographies. And we were actually able to find this site before he passed, and his wife Barbara Bush actually leaned on the Secretary of Defense to have the government do a recovery on this while George was still alive. So that was kind of a special thing for the team to know that we were in some small way part of this, being able to bring closure to 41. So with that, I think this is just my final picture. These sort of black and white images, I'd say, of some of these aviators. I know as a kid, I always thought lost kind of the personal touch to these people, and now as a father of young men, I can really appreciate these almost look like guys I might have cut high school with to go have fun with, and so it's just been a lot of fun in this program, being able to take some of the science and technology that usually ends up in kind of peer-reviewed journal articles that general public aren't aware of, and applying it to a special project like this. So I think with that, I will be happy to answer any questions. I don't know if I'm over time or under time.
No, you're fine. And I'm
okay.
sure that our members will have questions. What a fascinating presentation. I mean, I'm sure there are others like me who had no idea that, things like this were going on. Kudos. I mean, really incredible. I was wondering, do you bring up entire pieces of the airplanes, or dive teams go down and collect remains?
That's a great question. So, especially in working with foreign countries, they're often worried that we might be treasure hunters, or we are not object collectors. The goal is to find and document the sites, and we do have arrangements with the U.S. government that if we do come across human remains, we can be in a position to make the recovery. And some of the members of our team are certified by the government to handle the remains from a chain of custody perspective. So we had a very special situation happened just when COVID was kicking off and changing the world. We were in Vietnam doing a search, and there was a B-52 collision that had occurred. And while we were on scene, we actually came across the parachute, and I started getting goosebumps underwater. I get goosebumps now talking about it. But we realized we were at a very special hallowed place underwater where there was remains of a lost aviator. And so we were in a position where we surfaced, got back on the boat, talked to we had a number of Vietnamese government officials embedded with us, as well as US officials. We made a number of calls over the weekend, and they authorized us to do the recovery that weekend. We conducted a remain recovery, and then thankfully the family was notified about 6 months later, and that was really special. Our as an organization, we feel it's really the government's responsibility to alert families. So we try to work behind the scenes and provide the information, and then let the U.S. government do its job.
And are there any other countries which have reached out to you to gain expertise to do their own sorts of similar programs?
I'll say in the European theater, yes. We've had some groups working with like the Danish Navy and the Norwegians and other countries, and but we've had other countries that just don't really want to be told about, reminded of some of the difficulties of the war. I'm trying to be political here. But.
Right. Members, questions? No?
Good.
All right. I'm not hearing any. I'm just totally fascinated by this. Is this all of what you do, or do you do other projects as well?
No, I will say this is become more of a passion than a project. And so this began in 2014, and what sort of leads my research group at Scripps really is the development of ocean technologies and doing ocean science. But we've just thankfully been in positions where we can exercise those tools, and for an application that isn't just that might lead to a publication. We are actually publishing data that result from these efforts, but we're able to thankfully turn information over to the government for other applications as well.
Got it.
So, and I'd have to, big shout out to the technical team that supports me and works with me. They all, rally behind this program as well, and really, put in the extra hours, really treat it much more than just a job when we're on mission here to do these surveys.
I'm sure you saw the note in the chat to keep up this powerfully important work. it is really important, not only to many families across the United States, but to the country. We thank you, Dr. Terrill, for your incredible work. It's
thank you.
really great. And thank you for sharing.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
This is John Wheeler. Is it the case that the things that you develop for this program have feedback into just more standard oceanography, and similarly that some of the work that you do in oceanography turns out to be an essential thing in this program?
Very much so. Not knowing my audience today, I wasn't sure how much to deep dive on the heavy duty science parts of this, but work we develop with studying sound propagating in the ocean, understanding the science of robotics and autonomy, looking at ocean currents and seabed movement and coastal erosion, are all tools that we're able to apply to be smarter at how to do these searches. And so that's it's what's satisfying for me is being able to essentially apply my scientific tradecraft to an application like this that most scientists don't often get an opportunity to do things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would think that the cross feedback would be remarkable.
Yep. No, it is. It really.
If you have to devise an exceedingly accurate but very small magnetometer, that probably is useful in both areas.